This is a lecture on for my statutory interpretation and regulation class. We're going to talk about Free Enterprise Fund versus the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. This is a 2010 Supreme Court case about appointment and removal powers. And essentially, the bottom line about this case is that Congress created a statutory scheme that had two levels of removal protection from the president, and the Supreme Court held that this was unconstitutional. Just to explain the statutory scheme here, this is going to be a somewhat shorter lecture than some of the ones I've recorded recently. The PCAOB was created as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act to provide oversight for some of the big accounting firms, because the accounting firms had basically colluded with some of the firms that collapsed, and first in the Enron series of scandals, and then in the subsequent ones. And so the accounting board was supposed to basically provide oversight for the big accounting firms, because the public and the securities agencies like the SEC rely on the data, so the reports and audits submitted by the accounting firms. And so here's how the scheme was going to work. The SEC commissioners would appoint the 5 members of the PCAOB. This does mean, if you remember our previous lectures on appointment and removal powers, and especially Morrison v. Olson, this makes the members of the PCAOB inferior officers. Now, don't worry, at this point, this is still constitutional, because the Appointments Clause specifically says that Congress could specify inferior officers that would be appointed by other presidential appointees and or other officials, and the president appoints the SEC commissioners. Now, the statute, though, also provided that the PCAOB officers could be removed only for good cause shown, and only by officers of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, this was sort of a legal innovation. In other words, the president cannot remove members of the PCAOB for any reason, and then the SEC could only do it for cause, sort of like in Humphrey's executor, except that we're one step removed from the president now. Now, keep in mind that we think that the SEC commissioners could be removed by the president in turn only for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. Now, just to emphasize the implications of this means that if a president was unhappy with the PCAOB, he would have to ask the SEC to remove members of the PCAOB and appoint new ones. And if they wanted to do what the president said, they would have to show cause to remove them. And if they didn't want it, and if they defied, if the members of the SEC said, we don't have to do what you say, then the president would have to find cause besides a policy disagreement or a simple disobeying of an order in order to remove SEC officers, and then reappoint ones who would in turn maybe find good cause to remove PCAOB board members. Now, to give an idea of the scope of the PCAOB and what was at stake in this case, every accounting firm in the country that audits public companies under the securities laws must register with this board and has to pay annual fees and comply with its rules and oversight. And the board inspects the registered firms and initiates formal investigations and can impose hefty sanctions in its disciplinary proceedings. The Supreme Court held that this sort of like dual layer of 4 cause limitations on removal of members of the board violated the constitutional separation of powers framework. On the other hand, part of the challenge to the statute was from the Free Enterprise Fund was an objection to the fact that the members are appointed by the SEC instead of by the president directly. And on that note, the Supreme Court said that there really wasn't a constitutional problem. Also note that the court said that the offending removal provisions were severable. And for my statutory interpretation class, please keep in mind that we brought this up a little bit in the first part of the semester. Severability is a big issue in statutory interpretation. If there's a part of the statute, and it kind of ties in with the avoidance canon, if there's part of the statute that's unconstitutional, then the court has to answer a question of, do we throw out the whole statute, or can we save the rest of the statute? So in this case, the Supreme Court held that the rest of the statute survives, as does the PCAOB, except the president has to be able to remove the members directly. If you're looking for an attendance password to document that you've watched this lecture, our phrase is last antecedent, last antecedent.